after last night's World Cup result. But the truth is, there isn't that much to be found. Throughout this month, there'll be strikes in huge swathes of our public services. It will, of course, be very disruptive for people travelling for Christmas and economically damaging when we're already in recession. But with nurses and ambulance staff joining the action, there are now real fears for an NHS already in serious crisis, long before the worst of the winter. There are a few more dangerous things for a government than the sense that the country is grinding to a halt. While Number 10 will be pleased to have calmed the chaos of recent months, there is real peril in the weeks ahead. Much to discuss on a chilly morning here in Westminster. With my guests, we are talking to the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, in just a moment. And with the NHS in a seemingly perpetual and growing crisis, I'll talk to Labour's Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting. Also staying with the NHS, and given those upcoming nurse and ambulance strikes, plus the Strep A outbreak and the worst of the winter yet to come, I'll talk to the Deputy Chair of the British Medical Association, that's Dr. Emma Runswick. With so many unions involved in so many disputes, we'll talk to Kevin Rowan of the Trades Union Congress. And with yet more allegations of bad behaviour, misconduct and worse here in Westminster, I'll be joined by the former Special Advisor to not one, but two Chancellors, Sonia Khan. Well, there is much on the domestic agenda to trouble the government. Strikes in so many parts of the public sector, the health service in real danger, and the ongoing cost of living crisis. All that as the global situation remains tense, with the war in Ukraine entering a grim winter and relations with Russia and China as cold as ever. So a good time to talk to the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, who will give his first major policy speech in the job tomorrow. We started by discussing the upcoming strikes. I'm going to start with the nurses' strike. The Royal College of Nursing say that they want to meet the Health Secretary to stop the strike. They say they've offered to negotiate 5 times, but the Health Secretary has turned them down. This is what Pat Cullen, their General Secretary, said. He said, negotiate with the nurses and avoid this strike. 5 times my offer to negotiate has been turned down. I will press pause on it when the Health Secretary says he will negotiate seriously on our dispute this year. That means each of us giving some ground. When members of the public think it's extraordinary that the Health Secretary doesn't appear willing to sit down with the nurses.
Well, the Health Secretary has said that he is, of course, happy to meet. He said his door is open. He said that in the article that he wrote today. I think people need to understand, though, that the negotiation on pay is done by an independent pay review body. And so often we see people saying we need to take the politics out of this. These things need to be done by independent professionals. So we put in place an independent pay review body. We've accepted and implemented their findings in full. Of course, the Health Secretary wants to talk to the profession about how we can make the job better, how we can improve the NHS performance for everybody. But ultimately, pay is decided by an independent pay body.
We'll
That's how it should be.
Independent pay bodies in a moment. But the fact of the matter is, you know, if they're willing to sit down and talk to the Health Secretary, and they've said that they are 5 times, isn't he hiding behind this independent pay review body? You know, he should meet them, shouldn't he?
Well, he said he's willing to meet them, but again,
But saying you're willing to meet them and then not meeting them.
The point
you're going to
is,
meet somebody, meet them.
But the point is, meetings are different from pay negotiations. And through most of my time when I've been involved in politics, people have said they keep saying they want to take the politics out of this. We massively value the work that health professionals do. My mother was a midwife. Like many people in the country, I've got good friends who are health professionals, and we value them enormously. But ultimately, independent bodies are there for a reason, is to take the politics out of this kind of stuff, and we respect the judgment they made and we're implementing it.
But there is politics in this, isn't there? And in the end, it's the government that controls the purse strings. And you talk about these independent pay review bodies, but when they made these pay recommendations, this was before inflation got up to the levels it is. Their figures are, some would say, really woefully out of date. And these are bodies that are appointed by the government. often staffed by people who've got a background within the NHS themselves in management. So some would say, question really whether they are that independent.
Oh,
but,
no.
But fundamentally, doesn't the government need to talk to the people that they're negotiating with before they even get to the point of talking numbers? They need to physically sit down and negotiate with the nurses.
Well, so I think it's... I don't think it's right at all to question the independence of these bodies. As you say, they're often people from the sectors in which they are making decisions. And of course, we recognise the value of the work that's done by the medical professions. But these independent pay review bodies are there for a reason. It's what people have been calling for, as I say, for most of the time that I've been involved in politics, that there's real independence in these decisions. And it's really important to recognise that the 19.2% request would cost something in the region of £10 billion to match just that pay award, which is a larger sum of money than the £8 billion we're putting in over the next 2 years for health and social care to address the backlog. And that's of course, the challenge that we've got to recognise. We are very focused on making sure the NHS is delivering for the British people. We hugely respect the professionals within it, but we have to be sensible with our expenditure.
But it's not respectful if you're not willing to talk with them. Now, the RCN have said today that they are very willing to...
No, hang on, that's not... The Health Secretary has said today that he is, of course, willing to talk to them, but that pay negotiations are done through the independent...
OK, so will he sit down with the Royal College of Nursing in the next day or so and avert the strikes that we're expecting later this week?
Well, in the op-ed, he said his door is open, but we've also made it clear that the pay negotiations are done through the independent pay review body.
So he won't negotiate pay with the nurses. He will simply say, go back to the independent pay review body.
Well, so the question I ask is do we respect those independent pay bodies or not?
You keep saying you respect them, but the fact of the matter is, if the independent pay review body is saying one thing and the nurses are saying another, we've got the Health Secretary who doesn't appear to be talking to the nurses directly. He's the only one who can solve it. He's the only one who can sit in the middle and say, right, this is what they say, this is what you want, let's try and reach a compromise.
But that is the role. Sorry, I mean, that is the role of the independent pay review body. It's the clues in the name. It's independent and it reviews pay awards for those bodies. But they're not the ones who control
the purse strings. They're not the ones who make the decision. It's a recommendation they make. It's up to the government.
It is a recommendation. It's a recommendation and a recommendation. It's a recommendation and a recommendation that we have agreed to implement.
But it just doesn't seem that there's any way to resolve this then. If the government is saying we are simply not going to move from what the independent pay review body says, we are not willing to negotiate at all with the nurses about what they believe.
Sorry, this question is going around in circles.
Well, the point is, I feel like I'm not getting a straight answer.
No,
from
you. Sorry, you're not getting an answer you like.
No,
but that's different. I'm giving you a straight answer.
I'm struggling to understand why.
The independent pay review bodies...
How do we resolve it?
The independent pay review bodies were created to resolve differences between the bodies that seeking pay, whether they be in the health profession, teaching profession, other professions, and the government that hold the purse strings. They are the adjudicator. They were created. They are independent of government. They are staffed by experts. That is why they exist. They make recommendations. And in this instance, the government has accepted the recommendation fully.
But the nurses don't accept it, and it seems, therefore, that there is no way to move forward from this.
Well, as I said, the Health Secretary has said his door is open. He wants to talk to the health professionals about how we drive performance in the NHS, how we make sure that it's a job that they want to do, that all these things. But, as I say, the independent pay review bodies do what we ask them to do, which is to review pay, independent of the government. Indeed. We accept their recommendations.
Ambulance staff are out on strike this week. Do you think people will die because of it?
Well, we want to make sure that people are safe. We very much regret the fact that the ambulance service and other key public services are going on strike. We recognise there is a huge amount of pressure on everybody, because of COVID, because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the inflationary pressures that put on household prices. We do recognise that. But the role of the ambulance service is important. We are looking at contingency planning to make sure that we can keep people safe. And people should rely on the NHS. They should call 999 if there's a problem. and we'll work to make sure that they can be moved from where they are to where they need to be treated.
If people die because they can't get ambulances, who do you think will be
Well,
responsible?
I'm not going to speculate on that. We are putting contingency plans in place. We will be working to make sure that people are able to rely on emergency services.
Let's turn to foreign policy. Obviously, you are making a big, major policy speech as Foreign Secretary, setting out a doctrine of new partnerships with fast-growing countries, including Asia, Africa, Latin America. They're not traditional trading partners of the UK. Why didn't we trade with them in the past?
Well, it's not just about trading relationships. This is one of the points I'm going to make in the speech. Trade is an important part of a bilateral relationship, but good diplomatic relations in a number of these countries where we have development partnerships helping them develop their economies. The point I'm making is that if you project forward over the next 15, 25, 30 years, there are a number of countries, fast-growing countries, who are going to be increasingly wealthy and therefore important trade partners, but they are going to be increasingly influential on the world stage. And I want to make sure that the values, the principles that the UK feels strongly about are ones that we're discussing with these increasingly wealthy, yes, but influential countries of the next few decades.
You talk about values and principles. Let's talk about Iran. It's just carried out its first execution of a protester for taking part in dissent against the regime. This is Mohsen Shikari. He was charged with holding up traffic, assaulting a guard. He's dead. You have talked very tough on Iran. You've said on Friday, you said you want to hold the country to account. You're imposing sanctions on a small number of people. But the government's own figures show that trade with Iran went up 113% over the last year. How do you square that as Foreign Secretary? You know, on one hand, you're saying this is despicable what is happening here, but we're very happy to trade with the country. In fact, we're happy to do more trade with the country. So
I think you'll find that that is an increase on a very, very, very small figure. And obviously where there are, when figures are quite
modest... it's £287 million that we trade with Iran. Yeah.
Which, if you look at the trade figures of almost any other countries, is almost negligible. The point is that the response of the regime to protesters internally is completely unacceptable. We called in the Iranian ambassador last week. We summoned the Iranian ambassador last week to hold him accountable for what's happened. We are sanctioning people who are involved in human rights abuses, as well as the broader sanctions that are in place as part of our effort to prevent Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon. Iran knows that we feel very, very strongly about this, and they should understand that these are grassroots protests from their own people who are criticising the Iranian regime for the oppression of the Iranian people.
OK, well, let's move on to a country which you do spend even more money with, and that's Saudi Arabia. Trade with Saudi Arabia is worth £13.7 billion. I noticed that in this article that you wrote on Friday, you didn't mention Saudi Arabia. 81 men were executed there last year. And at the time, the Foreign Office Minister, Alan Duncan, said there's a deep murkiness here that we do not like, but it obviously doesn't stop us dealing with them. Up 26% last year, the trade with Saudi Arabia. Are you proud of being Foreign Secretary of a country that trades with a country that actually crucifies people in public?
Well, I have spoken with the Saudis about our long-standing principled position on the death penalty, as I do with pretty much all countries around the world that maintain the death penalty. They know it's a long-standing principled opposition to us. Saudi, of course, is not just economically, but culturally, religiously, an incredibly important, influential country in the Middle East and further. It's incredibly important that we maintain an ongoing bilateral relationship with Saudi. Some of that includes trade, but also in terms of security, counter-terrorism work. And when we have a relationship with the country, of course we highlight where there are differences, and on this issue we have very, very deep differences. But we also seek to find the areas where we can exert influence, and I have, in fact, been supportive of the reform programme that Saudi's putting forward. And we have seen real changes over the last decade. I want to see those changes go further and faster. I believe that many people in the Saudi government would like to do so also.
But you see the concern that it appears that the British government will deal with countries that do have objectionable human rights records if it's worth it for us. And you're talking about this new policy that you're going to embrace lots of other countries. A lot of people will look at that and say, hang on, is the British government now the kind of government that will deal with these states and just hold their nose if we think that it's good for trade?
Well, look, you keep referring to trade. Trade is not the only element. In fact, with many of these countries, it's not the most significant element at all. But the point I'm making, the point I'll make in the speech, is that we are in a competitive global environment. A number of these countries that are developing fast are becoming, as I say, increasingly influential on the world stage, not just economically, but politically. What's the word I'm looking for? Diplomatically, are being wooed. They are being wooed, and they have choices. And either we find a way of encouraging those countries to move in the direction that we think is the right direction, increase openness, increase reform within themselves, as we are doing with Saudi Arabia and others, or we can choose to detach. But those countries will still be influential, those countries will still be important, but those countries will increasingly be detached from us. I don't think that's in their interest, and I certainly don't think it's in the UK's national interest. So we work with countries, and when we have disagreements, we highlight those disagreements. Where we have opportunities to exert influence, we seek to exert influence as well.
What about Egypt? A few weeks ago, the sister of Alaa Abd al-Fattah, the British Egyptian political prisoner who's held there, made an appeal to the British Prime Minister on this programme to try and get her brother's release. What progress have you made? Well,
the Prime Minister spoke with President Sisi on this issue. I've spoken with the Egyptian Foreign Minister on this. I know our officials speak with Egyptian officials on this regularly as well. So we are working, we continue to work on these consular cases, both in Egypt and in elsewhere. We want to make sure that we have access to this person who is a dual Egyptian-British national, and we will keep working. And sometimes these conversations are done publicly, often they are done privately, but I can assure you and the viewers that we continue working on this.
There haven't been any specific diplomatic consequences, have there?
Well, as I say, we do continue to talk to the Egyptians about this, and I know we're not alone in doing that.
OK. Let's move on to the situation in Ukraine. Earlier this week, Vladimir Putin said Russia could reach agreements about Ukraine in the future. Reading the runes, do you think there is any possibility that there could potentially be peace talks on the horizon? Well,
ultimately, of course, we do want to see peace in Ukraine. We see the brutalisation of the Ukrainian people. We see the impact that war is having on grain prices and grain availability around the world. I've just come back from Ethiopia, where the impact of the war in Ukraine is being felt with regard to food insecurity. So, of course, we want to see this resolved. But we have always made the case, I have always made the case, that any negotiations need to be real, they need to be meaningful. They can't just be a fig leaf for Russian rearmament and further recruitment of soldiers, whether that be from the Wagner Group or trawling prisons in Russia. So, of course, we do want to see peace talks, but they need to be meaningful. And ultimately, the content of those peace talks, the threshold that might be met in terms of bringing peace has got to be decided by the Ukrainian people, the Ukrainian president, because, of course, they're the ones whose sons and daughters are being killed in this war.
Do you sense there's any changes on that front? Do you sense that it could be the possibility that there are talks?
Well, at the moment, I'm not really seeing anything coming from the Russian side that gives me confidence that Vladimir Putin is entering these talks in good faith. The wider rhetoric is still very confrontational. But ultimately, as I say, we want to see this resolved. We would prefer to see it resolved sooner rather than later. But that resolution has got to be meaningful.
What if Russia pulled back to just occupying Crimea? Would that, in your mind, be a fair basis to have peace talks?
So look, I don't want to start setting the conditions for what Ukraine and the Ukrainian people should accept. ultimately, it's their country that they're defending. It's their sons and daughters that have been lost. It's their homes, their infrastructure that has been damaged by Vladimir Putin's invasion. And it's up for them to decide the circumstances under which they'll be willing to negotiate for peace.
OK. Lots of other stories in the news this week, including a documentary that's come out of America, Harry and Meghan. I don't know if you've had a chance to see it with your busy schedule. Given the row over that and also comments made by a member of the public at a reception at the Palace a couple of weeks ago, do you think the royal family has a problem with racism?
Well, look, I'm not going to discuss the documentary, not least because when I get a spare moment, I'm trying to catch up with Stranger Things when I watch television rather than that particular documentary.
Some of your colleagues think they should lose their titles.
Well, look, my view in all the interactions that I have had with the royal family, and I do have the opportunity to do so more than most because of my role as Foreign Secretary, I've seen a group of people who are passionate about supporting the Britain as it is. The King has spoken in the past when he was Prince of Wales about the wonder that is the multicultural nature of this country. I get to travel the world, and when you do, you get to look back at the UK as others see us. And I'm very proud of what I see. I see a very well-integrated, multi-ethnic country that I think can be very proud of its diverse heritage. And I think the royal family's attitude to this country reflects the modern country that we see. That's my personal experience, but I also think that is something that the whole world sees when they look at us.
They also look at us in terms of football. Did you get a chance to watch it last night?
I did, and I know exactly what's going to happen next. My good friend, the French Foreign Minister, was sending me little messages just before she boarded a flight. So I know that she didn't watch the game because she was in the air. I'm dreading to think when she wakes up this morning what messages await me. Look, it was a good match. I think France had the first half, England had the second half. I think our boys did incredibly well. We should be really proud of them. Tough result, but we should be proud of them. I
Entente Cordiale remains in place. I saw Rishi Sunak, wishing France well for the next round. I mean, some people would say, should he be doing that?
Look, sport brings people together. I mean, that's the point. Sport brings people together. It was a good match. I've got my eye on Morocco. There's something there, and it's incredibly exciting. African team going that far. This is, the round of 8 is I think always the most exciting bit of the tournament. Typically, as you get close to the final, everyone gets a little bit more cautious. But yeah, look, there's some really good some really interesting results. It's going to be an interesting final.
James Cleverly, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, that was the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly. Let's get the view from Labour now. I can talk to the Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting. Mr Streeting, really good to talk to you today. Thanks very much for joining us, especially given how cold it is outside. We were talking about, aside from the football, the state of the NHS, strikes, the current state of the NHS, and you've written an interesting piece in the Sunday Telegraph today. You say that after the pandemic, there are no quick fixes for the NHS and that you're terrified by the state of it. What would Labour do first and why?
So at the centre of Labour's plans to make the NHS fit for the future is the biggest expansion of the NHS workforce in history, because unless we have the staff we need, we won't be able to give patients the timely access to care that they deserve. So that would be the biggest expansion of the NHS staff in history, doubling the number of medical school places, increasing nursing and midwifery clinical training places by 10,000, 5,000 more health visitors, and doubling the number of district nurses. And we would pay for it by abolishing the non-dom tax status, because we think that people who make Britain their home should pay their taxes here too. And this is a fair way of funding something that's desperately needed, because unless you've got a plan for the workforce, you don't have a plan for the NHS, and unfortunately that's the terrible situation this government has found itself in, and that's the difference a Labour government would make.
Your critics would say that abolishing non-dom status is something of a cheap shot to get at the Prime Minister and his personal circumstances. what is the evidence that it actually would bring in that money? Because some would say that actually the very wealthy will simply take the best advice and move themselves and their money elsewhere and deny it to the Treasury. And also that your plans, yes, you're talking about far more staff members, which would be enormously welcomed in the NHS. But, for example, doctors, getting more doctors through the system, this takes years and years. You're talking solutions that will help in 5 to 10 years' time.
So I say a few things in response. I mean, firstly, the figures we've used and the analysis we've used is independent, produced by academics at Warwick University and the London School of Economics. It would generate more than £3 billion. That's more than enough to cover the £1.6 billion that our package would cost. And as for these claims that people would just take their money and go somewhere else, why is it that when it comes to taxing the wealthy, it's always far too difficult, but when it comes to picking the pockets of working people with punitive tax rises, that seems to be the Conservatives' first and last resort? And look, we haven't taken this policy to single out the Prime Minister and his family, actually, but there is a case in point in 10 Downing Street, isn't there, of someone who was a non-dom, now pays their taxes here and hasn't left the country. And I think that would be the case in the vast majority of non-doms too. And while I understand that the Chancellor wants good relations with his next-door neighbours, who doesn't, I do think this is a fair way of funding a workforce plan, which Jeremy Hunt himself welcomed when Labour first announced it. And he said, and these are his words, the smart governments nick the best ideas of his opponents. Well, I'm saying this morning, Jeremy, you're welcome to nick Labour's workforce plan. We need to get our skates on recruiting the doctors and nurses and other staff the NHS needs. You're welcome to nick the plan. And in the meantime, Sophie, there are things the government can and should be doing right now to alleviate the crisis in the NHS this winter, whether that's using spare beds in the private sector so that we pay for people to get seen faster, so it's free at the point of use for them, but much quicker using that capacity available. Whether it's dealing with the pensions issues that see doctors leaving the NHS early, retiring early for no other reason than their pension rules create a financial disincentive to stay on, or whether it's actually just pulling their finger out, and even where they're trying to do the right thing, like the £500 million to deal with delayed discharge in social care. Do you know not a penny of that money has hit the front line yet? Why? Because of all the chaos we saw over the summer, changing from health secretary to health secretary, from prime minister to prime minister. I'm afraid the Conservatives' incompetence and chaos is costing the country dear. But there are things they can and should be doing. We're calling on them to take that action. But ultimately, I think it's clear now after 12 years that the longer the Conservatives are in power, the longer patients will wait.
You're talking about the Conservatives nicking your ideas, but looking at this piece that you've written, it seems like you're nicking a lot of theirs. You've just referred to using the private sector more. Some would be astonished at seeing this policy coming from a Labour politician. You've also talked about the BMA, who we are going to be talking to later on in the programme, as vested interests. You say that they see you as a heretic for wanting better patient access, and you're going to take them on. How do you think these lines will go down with traditional Labour voters?
Well, the last Labour government successfully used the private sector to bring down NHS waiting lists. And, you know, by the end of that Labour government, use of the private sector had fallen dramatically because the NHS was so good that people didn't feel the need to go private any longer. And as for the question of values, I think it's outrageous we've got a two-tier healthcare system in this country today, where those who can pay to go private do, and those who can't afford to go private are left behind. Or indeed, there are some people that are scrimping and scraping, even getting themselves into debt in order to get seen faster. That's not a fair and equitable situation. That's not the NHS living up to its founding principles. And I think it's the right thing to do to create a level playing field, using empty beds in the private sector so that people can be seen faster. And as for the BMA, I mean, I was just responding in that interview with The Telegraph to criticism they levelled at me, because despite the fact that I announced the biggest expansion of NHS staff in history, because I had the temerity to say that we should also expect better service for patients in exchange for that investment, because I think that it's unacceptable that people have to wait on the phone at 8 o'clock in the morning to get through to GP. I have been treated like some kind of heretic by the BMA, and I'm afraid, you know, I do understand the pressure that doctors are under. They do a very difficult job against very difficult backdrop. But what I'm saying is, if we're putting investment into the NHS, as the next Labour government will, we have got to expect better results for patients. And ultimately, it's my job to be the patient's champion. I'm a patient myself. I've had great experience on the NHS. I've also had not great experience on the NHS. I want to make sure that everyone in this country gets a great experience and that we've got an NHS that's fit for the future.
But as the man who could very soon be Health Secretary, it doesn't sound like you've got a really great relationship from the start with the doctors' unions.
Look, I'm always willing to engage with the BMA. In fact, on the doctors' pensions issue, where they've made a reasonable point, as they did on that issue, I'm prepared to run with it. But what I'm not prepared to do is just accept lower standards for patients, because people think that it's unachievable to expect that people should be able to book a GP appointment online or see the doctor they want to face-to-face, get faster treatment. I do understand the pressures that are on NHS staff today. That's why we're proposing to dramatically increase NHS staffing numbers. That's why on issues like retention of the staff we have, we're both urging the government to act on doctors' pensions, but also urging them to be grown up and get around the table with the unions that are preparing to go on strike, who even at this 11th hour are saying there is a deal to be done. I mean, the Royal College of Nursing and Unison have said just last night that if the government is prepared to sit down and talk about pay and all of the other issues, they will suspend strike action this week. Now, I think that is an offer that is too good to refuse, and I want the government to explain why they're not prepared to sit down and even talk, even though they know that patients will experience real disruption as a result of strike action.
Well,
patients will know who to blame. It'll be the government that's responsible.
We spoke to James Cleverly earlier, and he said that the Health Secretary's door is open, but that it's up to the independent pay review bodies to make a ruling on pay. You also said in this piece that the NHS is a service.
But the government's line's a joke on that, Sophie. The government's line is a complete joke on that. There hasn't been a single minute of negotiation. You've got the General Secretary of the Royal College of Nursing and the General Secretary of Unison saying they will suspend strike action this week if the government will talk. They've not even said if the government, you know, rolls over and accepts the entirety of their pay demand. They have said very reasonably, if the government talks, we'll be there and will suspend strike action. It is completely unreasonable for the government not to want to negotiate. And I think they are spoiling with a fight. I think they don't have a plan for the NHS this winter. They're quite happy to see paramedics and nurses go on strike, because when the proverbial hits the fan this winter, they are going to blame nurses and paramedics for an NHS crisis which is squarely the fault of a Conservative government and 12 years of mismanagement. I think that's dangerous. I think it's reprehensible. I think it's irresponsible. And I think patients will rightly blame the government, not the unions, if these strikes go ahead.
OK, well, let's talk money then. What pay rises would the Labour Party give NHS workers? Let's look at the NHS itself. There are 9 bands in NHS pays, I'm sure you know. Let's look sort of in the middle, band 4-ish. A theatre support worker, this is the person that holds your hand when the anaesthetic's going into your arm, make sure that you're all right, make sure the surgeon has all the tools that they need. They're currently on around £24,000 to £26,000 a year, which is about £12 to £13 an hour. What would Labour give them? What do you think would be a fair pay rise?
So we would be willing to negotiate, Sophie, and negotiate on pay, the wider terms and conditions, and the way that the independent pay review body works. I'm not going to pluck numbers out of thin air this morning, not least because a Labour government, after an election that's probably going to be in around 2 years' time, will have to judge the situation as it is then. And I don't want to create hostages to fortune.
The government shouldn't be doing.
No, I don't want to be misunderstood on that point, Sophie. What I said is that we would look at how the pay review body works, because when I have been talking to the RCN, Unison, GMB and Unite, they raise a whole range of issues, yes, around pay and the terms and conditions that staff are working under, which I think are intolerable. But they've also talked about the independence of the pay review body and the way it works. I'd be willing to look at all of those
scrap the current
issues,
system.
engage seriously.
The pay review body system. Do you think it's up for review?
I'd be willing to amend. No, it's important that we have independent pay review bodies, and I think the unions have raised some legitimate concerns about how they work. I'd be willing to look at that. But what I'm not prepared to do, Sophie, this morning is to create hostages to fortune, and worse still, make promises for 2 years' time that I may not be able to keep, because when I come on your programme and say the Labour Party will deliver the biggest expansion of NHS staff in history, it's because I can guarantee what it would cost, how we would pay for it, and the decision it would make. That's the approach we're taking to all of our policies. And sometimes I know it's frustrating for people who want us to go further, faster, for all of the campaign and lobby groups who want us to adopt this policy or that policy, but the Conservatives have crashed the economy. The public finances are in a real mess. And I want to make sure, as all of us in the Labour Party do, that when we go into the election, the public can have confidence that we can keep the promises that we make. So my message to the government today is get around the table with the unions. You can avert strike action. The unions are being entirely reasonable on this. Negotiate today, avert strike action, and we'll be willing to talk to the unions about how we make sure that the staff who are currently in the NHS feel valued, how we get the economy growing again so that we can invest in our public services and improve people's pay without having to resort to higher taxes as the Conservatives had, and to work together to reform the NHS so that it's fit for the future.
OK, we're nearly out of time, but I just wanted to ask you a little bit about the relationship between the Labour Party and the unions. We've had further allegations this week about the Unite union, 2 reports being handed over to the police from its own review into what happened there. When you look at the allegations that there are, do you think it's time for the Labour Party to step back from the way it is funded, relying on the unions for so much of its funding? Do you think it is time to think again about how your party is funded?
Well, 2 things. Firstly, I think the current General Secretary of Unite, Sharon Graham, deserves enormous credit for being willing to open the books and go through them, call in the investigators to make sure that her members' subs are properly used. And I think the findings we've seen are deeply worrying. But, you know, it takes guts to uncover the levels of wrongdoing that appear to have taken place in Unite, and I think she deserves credit for that. The second thing is the Labour Party was founded by the trade unions to stand up for the interests of working people. That, throughout our history, I think has been a strength. We don't always agree. We can't always say yes to every demand that the trade unions make. But I think what the trade union link has done throughout Labour's history is root us in the experiences and the interests of ordinary working people who, without the Labour Party, would not have a voice in British politics, because, as the Conservatives have shown us throughout their history, they act in the interests of a privileged few at the top. The Labour Party exists to serve the interests of the many. That's the fundamental dividing line in British politics, and that has never been more true than it is today.
OK, Wes Streeting, very good to talk to you. Thank you very much. You're watching Sophie Ridge on Sunday. If you are confused, I am, of course, not Sophie. I am Jayne, and I'm with you for the rest of the programme. That was Wes Streeting making it very clear that he thinks the government should get around the table and talk to the nurses. Just before that, I spoke to the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, who told me that the Health Secretary's door was open to talks with the unions, but that all discussions about pay need to go through the pay review body. So no signs of that dispute, it seems, being resolved imminently. Still to come on the programme this morning. In just a moment, we'll delve deeper into the crisis in the NHS. I'll talk to the Deputy Chair of the British Medical Association Council, Dr. Emma Runswick. And a little later, we'll discuss the strikes across the public sector with Kevin Rowan of the Trades Union Congress. Plus, we'll get some immediate reaction from our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. He's got his Christmas lights out. He's watching all our interviews, and we'll talk to Sam a little bit later on. Well, let's turn back to the NHS now, and a health service which seems to be in an ever-growing crisis as waiting times and lists grow well before the usual winter crisis. Nurses and ambulance staff will walk out on strike this month, and junior doctors will be balloted on action soon. That will be held by the British Medical Association, which is both the trade union and professional bodies for doctors in the UK. its council. Deputy Chair Dr Emma Runswick joins me now. Very good to talk to you. We just spoke to Wes Streeting there, Shadow Health Minister. He says he's not afraid to take you on. He calls you vested interests and says that you think he's a heretic for wanting better patient access. Are you concerned that you perhaps don't have as good a relationship as you should with the man who may well be Health Secretary very soon?
Well, certainly I'm disappointed in the rhetoric that Mr Streeting is adopting.
He said he was replying to charges that you'd made against him.
Well, this morning he's said in the Telegraph that NHS staff are looking for something for nothing. And I think my members and many health staff across the UK will be absolutely gobsmacked by that, because we are giving everything and receiving less than nothing in return, pay cuts, real terms pay cuts in return. And we agree that we want a better health service. We're working in it. I see patients, every week who have been waiting for a long time to see us. And it's really devastating working in that situation where we know we're not providing the standards of care that we want to be. The solution isn't to attack the staff. The solution is to attack the government, who are absolutely responsible for driving our service into the ground with underfunding and understaffing.
So surely the solution is fixing this, isn't it? It's sitting down, talking about it and finding a solution rather than attacking anybody. Do you feel that you can talk to the government?
The choice is between attacking and blaming NHS staff and directing the blame where it really is deserved at the feet of the government. Then I think Mr Streeting needs to really focus on the government who are responsible for the problems we face.
There have been dire warnings from all parts of the NHS and some of the statistics that have been, in the news so much over the last few days. In all of your times working in the NHS, have you ever seen it this bad?
No, I think the honest answer is no, we haven't ever seen it this bad. We've got, such extreme levels of vacancy, about 10,000 doctors missing in secondary care alone, 47,000 nurses missing. We've got 1,900 GPs fewer than we did in 2015, and providing more appointments than ever. So 32 million appointments provided by those GPs this year. And yet we absolutely can't meet the demand that we have on the service. And that's a whole mixture of factors, but it means that we can't do as well as we would want to for patients. And, we hear all of the real patient stories that underlines that misery for us. And it impacts on our mental health and our well-being as well. And that's why so many are leaving, and one of the reasons so many are leaving. If we want to fix those problems, we really have to tackle the issues of pay, pensions and working conditions that are forcing staff out. It's not just about recruitment at the bottom end, it's about keeping the staff who are already in the service and providing training to our younger colleagues.
Do you think the NHS can cope this winter?
Well, the NHS is already collapsing and has been for some time now. So are we going to see worsening of that collapse as demand increases this winter? And we have another COVID wave, we have another flu wave, we have the Strep A, both situation and the panic associated with it. Are we going to see worsening situation? I'm almost certain of that. What can the government do?
Do you think more people will die?
I do think more people will die, and I don't think that's not something that we want. And there are some solutions to that, but currently the government won't even speak to us. So we're in a really difficult situation that none of us want to be in as health workers. We've all committed to providing excellent patient care. We're aware that we're not able to do that at the minute, and we're doing our best. We're driving ourselves into the ground trying to provide that, and we're working with each other, and increasingly we're organising to take a stand over our service. We want our profession, and for doctors, we want our profession to be valued, and we want our skills across the health service to be valued. We want the government and patients and the public to realise that we are trying, but also we're reaching the point where we have to take action, because if we don't do anything, it will keep getting worse.
And you're balloting your members for a pay rise for junior doctors. What do you think the likelihood is that they will go out on strike in the new year?
I think it's likely, unless the government is willing to negotiate with us about pay. So we're asking for a reversal of a pay cut we've had, a pay cut for junior doctors of 26.1% since 2008. So over a quarter of our pay has been lost. This year, again, we've received 2% pay award, which is about 10% less than inflation. That's another month working for free, working a whole month for free compared to last year.
Okay, so what would you
the government
like?
currently won't even say.
Sorry, forgive me, we haven't got a huge amount of time, but what number would you like? If your dream number that the government would give you?
Well, we're looking for pay restoration. So restoration, reversal of that pay cut. Yeah, absolutely. But it's only
you really
a lot
think
of
the government will
money.
give you a 25% pay rise?
Well, it's only as steep as the money that has been cut from us. It's only as steep as the money that we've lost. So if the government has continued to give us below inflation pay awards year after year, claps do not pay the bills. We are at a point now where we are, 10,000 doctors short in secondary care alone, 1,900 fewer GPs than we've had in the past. We really need to tackle the problems of keeping staff in the service, and whether that's doctors, nurses, ambulance staff, paramedics, radiographers, the whole team really need to understand and to be valued by the government, and therefore value our patients and the service that we're providing to them as well.
So to be clear on this programme, you're saying you want a 25% pay increase.
We're looking
as
for
you
pay
say.
restoration. So if as inflation changes, we will continue to seek restoration of the losses that we've had.
Okay. But you're saying that's 25%. I mean, as you referred to the goodwill that there was throughout COVID and the clapping on the doorsteps, many in the country would love to see those in the medical profession getting a pay rise. But you also said that you think people will die, partly as a result of the strikes, partly as a result of the state that the NHS is in over this winter. Do you think that there's going to be a change? Are you worried that the public will perhaps not be quite as much in love with the NHS after a few weeks of strikes as they are now?
I think that the public really understand that our desire for investment in health workers and the health service is fundamentally about the wanting to be able to provide a really excellent standard of care for patients. That's what it's about. There's an absolute link between investment in the health service and the quality of care we're able to provide. We all know that we're not currently providing that standard of care. We want to be able to do better, and therefore we are taking a stand and asking the government to invest in us and the service that we provide. I think the public know that, and I think it's really clear to them. If you don't trust doctors when you're asking this question, then ask the nurses. If you don't trust the nurses, then ask the paramedics. If you don't trust the paramedics, then there's so many of us who are now facing this same set of difficulties, having faced such attacks on our pay, on our conditions, and on our service, the service that we provide to you over such a long period of time. There's so many of us now facing these difficulties. All of us have come to the same conclusion, and all of us are looking for change. And I think that the public and patients will understand that.
OK, and just to be clear, you do think that it's very likely junior doctors will go on strike in the new year?
I do, unless there is change from the government. It's in the government's gift to negotiate.
That was very clear. Thank you very much. Dr. Emma Runswick, Deputy Chair of the BMA, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, as usual, The Take will follow this programme just after 9:30. Our chance to analyse today's interviews and talk through any news lines with our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. Let's get a quick take from Sam now on what stood out for him so far this morning. Sam, what have you made of the interview so far?
Good morning, Jane. Well, last night, the RCN, the Royal College of Nurses, and Unison suggested that they would call off the strike for nurses in England, Wales and Northern Ireland that begin on Thursday, even if the government's pay offer was below inflation. This morning, talking to you, James cleverly rejected the idea that ministers might get involved with negotiating pay with nurses to call off this strike. So that's a major moment. The government rejecting what appeared to be a fig leaf last night. We've already heard Labour criticise that decision. Interesting hearing James Cleverly's reasoning. He says it's not for ministers to negotiate on pay. Up to a point, Lord Copper. The pay review body reported last June when inflation was lower. Pay review bodies only provide, as you were saying to him, recommendations. Ministers often change it. And up in Scotland, actually, they went beyond. The Scottish Government went beyond what the pay review body suggested nationally, and there isn't a strike there. So ministers will be in the frame for this decision. This will increase the political temperature as a result of the interviews this morning.
Sam, thanks very much. Well, you've no doubt heard the term winter of discontent being thrown around at the moment, but are things really as bad as the late 1970s? And just how much worse could it get in coming months? Britain's biggest unions, Unite, Unison, the GMB, RMT, PCS, CWU, are taking hundreds of thousands of workers out on strike across public services, the transport network and the wider economy. It'll cause huge disruption and further damage an economy struggling with soaring inflation. Let's now talk to the head of public services at the organisation that represents all trade unions, the TUC. That's Kevin Rowan, and he joins me now. Mr. Rowan, very good to talk to you today. Thanks for joining us from up north. There are people who will not be able to travel after horrendous periods being apart since COVID over the Christmas period. That, along with many other disruptions to people's lives over the next few days. Are the unions holding the country to ransom?
Well, I think the unions are trying to get a fair deal for their members, and and you mentioned right across the economy, working people are suffering the cost of living crisis. Many of them haven't had a pay rise for several years in the public services. Most workers have had below inflation pay rises every year under this government. And you also heard that the reason why these strikes are not getting resolved and people are able to call those strikes off is because the government are effectively blocking the strikes being cancelled. So I think there is certainly a huge challenge here. There is certainly a massive impact on the economy, but the only way that we're going to resolve these issues is if people do get round the table and find a solution and don't block, and that the government doesn't block solutions when they are on the table.
The ambulance drivers' strikes is one that is causing a lot of fear for a lot of people. Just talking to the unions for the doctors, who said that she believed people probably would die over the coming weeks because of what is happening. Are you worried that there's going to be a shift in public attitudes to what is happening if people start losing their loved ones because of this?
Well, I think people are really, really worried about what's happening in the health service already before the strikes. We've seen ambulances waiting 6-8 hours before they can drop their patients off or get the patients into accident emergency. We're seeing people waiting longer than they have to in A&E and in other parts of the health service. What we're seeing is public services across the board that are falling apart at the seams. So I think the public are genuinely worried about that level of public service. And it's a real, I think, mark of shame on this government that those dedicated professionals that we all rely on and we all clapped through the pandemic feel so desperate that they have to take industrial action just to get the government to hear their experiences, both personal in terms of their wages, but also the services that they provide. That's what people are going on strike for, in order to protect services and ultimately give a decent service to those members of the public. And I think they get that. I think that they see where the fault lines here. They support the workforce, and they really want the government to get around the table and find a solution. At the moment, the government doesn't seem prepared to do that.
Yeah. Do you accept, though, that what you're asking for is unrealistic? 5% on top of inflation is a huge sum. The IFS thinks it would probably cost every household in the country about £640. Given the cost of living crisis, this just isn't a bill that the country as a whole can afford.
Well, I think you're right to focus on affordability, Jane. I mean, the fact is the government are making political choices around taxation. If they were to tax profit, capital gains tax and share dividends at the same rate that they're taxing wages, they would be able to afford to give every public service worker a fair pay rise. But they're choosing instead to effectively stuff the pockets of the wealthy who get their income from profits and shares, and squeeze the purses of the workers who are generating those profits. So these are political choices. The government could make different choices. that would allow them to pay public sector workers properly, but they're choosing not to do so.
In all fairness, the government, though, they did increase taxes on some of those higher salaries in the recent budget. The IFS also, as you know, independent and well-respected body, they say that when they look at remuneration, because the argument that we hear from unions like yourselves is that the public sector pay isn't keeping pace with private sector pay. Well, the IFS says when you look at the gap in total remuneration, accounting for differences in both pay in the private sector, as well as differences in employee characteristics, so things like pensions, etc. The public to private differential is about 6%. In other words, total remuneration for public sector workers, according to the IFS, is on average 6% higher than for those who are privately employed. So, you know, they would say that, and the government would say that you're not taking into account the other elements of working for the public service that are benefits. And that perhaps that is a little bit disingenuous, you know, when you're trying to put your case towards the public.
Well, the reality is that workers in local government, workers in health, and workers in the civil service at the lower end of those pay rates are bumping along just above the national minimum wage, just above in pennies. We're not talking about pounds, or pennies above the national minimum wage. So there is an absolute argument for improving pay in the public sector.
But there are lots in the private sector who are also on those salaries, aren't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And we think all workers should have a fair pay rise, whether they work in the private sector or in the public sector. And public sector workers have seen their pensions attached year on year. So people are paying more now in their pension schemes and enjoying a poorer pension when they retire. The fact is, every year, every single year under this Conservative government, public sector workers have been made worse off. And private sector workers haven't been made much better off either under this government. They're trashing the economy. Their taxing system favours the rich and not the working class. You know, these are choices that the government are making, and public sector workers deserve a fair pay rise.
OK, Kevin Rowan, Head of Public Services at the TUC, thank you very much. Time now for our final guest, and there were yet more allegations of misconduct in Westminster this week, from a Conservative MP losing the whip following a complaint made to police to claims of sleaze around the awarding of PPE contracts during the pandemic. It all adds up to a constant drip of stories ranging from bullying and harassment to rule breaking and serious sexual misconduct in recent years. So is there a particular problem in Westminster politics, and what is going wrong? Well, one person who might have a view, Sonia Khan, who was a special advisor to not one, but two Conservative chancellors in Philip Hammond and Sajid Javid. She settled an unfair dismissal claim, having been marched out of Downing Street, and has spoken of the environment of bullying and bad behaviour. Very good to talk to you today, Sonia. Are you surprised by what seems to be a constant stream of these kind of allegations and cases that are still coming out?
I'm not surprised. I think that over the last few years, we have created a system where actually people feel much more empowered to take action. I mean, it's not perfect, but I think what we have is a Westminster that hasn't really changed, but we have a group of people now that can work together, or have seen examples of other people who've taken action and feel comfortable to be able to say, actually, this behaviour is not okay, this isn't acceptable. I feel like there is much more of a standard now about what good and bad behaviour looks like in Westminster, whereas I don't think that quite existed before.
But we have had a number of inquiries, you know, Dame Laura Cox inquiry 2018, 2020, Sir Alex Allen's report into Priti Patel, now this inquiry into Dominic Raab. Do you think that they actually change anything? Do you think they're worth the paper they're written on?
It's difficult to say, because in my circumstance, I had to take legal action in order to change behaviours, or to get people to look at what actually went wrong, which isn't the ideal solution because it's quite a costly process. I think in truth, we have a system where the only change that happens is when it comes to general elections. So I guess you could say there's a way for constituents to change who their MP is if they think that actually the stories about bullying are right. But if you're a victim of bullying, whether you're in the civil service or whether you're someone who works in Westminster at quite a junior role, you work in Parliament, then there isn't really a way to change things other than you changing. So often that means people have to leave their job, or they leave the sector, or they go do something completely different. I've known people who've become doctors or have gone to work for charities because they don't like the culture of Westminster. So I guess there are elements that can be changed, but for most people, the way that change happens is they have to change the role themselves.
And we've seen, of course, a number of politicians, male and female, saying that they're not going to stand again in this current election, but quite a lot of them relatively young female MPs. Do you think political culture could have played a part in that?
I do, and I think that the scrutiny that many female MPs have is far greater than male MPs. We've seen people's romantic lives being dissected in newspapers. We've seen some of their sort of fashion choices dissected, and I feel like for a lot of them, it must come to the point where they decide that they don't want that anymore. So I can totally understand that, and I can also see why politics perhaps doesn't always feel very rewarding in this current environment, and how maybe they can affect change in perhaps slightly different roles.
There will be some, though, that will say, look, you know, politics, like lots of jobs, is a high-pressure environment. There are going to be big egos, there are going to be long hours, people are going to be exhausted, strong personalities. It's all part of the job. If you want to work in that environment, you just have to toughen up a bit.
There is that sense, and I would argue you can have that in so many careers. You can have that in law, you can have that in medicine, but the biggest difference between those careers and politics is that it isn't meritocratic. So you can be the smartest person, you could have dedicated your life to public service for 40 or 50 years, but that's not necessarily what's going to help you succeed. It's very, very reputation heavy, and I think that's where the frustration can come from a lot of people. So it's much more about, do you know the right person? Are you in favour with the right person? Do your actions sort of work for the current government? And I can see why that element of the job perhaps isn't very attractive. And I think that's perhaps the distinction to make between other careers, that you can succeed just by working hard, whereas in politics, there's a bit more of a game to be played.
So it seems that you're suggesting it's riddled with cronyism.
I mean, I think that it won't come as a surprise to anyone to find that where it's very much based on kind of who you know rather than what you know. I mean, you do need a base level of probably intelligence to be able to get on, especially with scrutiny that comes through select committees and whatever. But yeah, primarily it's have you voted the right way? Do you know the right people?
So it's who you know rather than what you know. There is still no independent advisor on ethics. Liz Truss said that, you know, she knew what ethics were and she didn't need one. Do you think that there should be somebody in place in that role, and soon?
I don't think that an advisor on ethics is going to fix the system that we have. I think it's much more structural than that. I think I've said before that there are always people at the bottom in politics, and I don't think you can change that. But you do need to look at how do you create a system that encourages those people to speak up and does it in a way that makes them feel very protected. So I'm talking about, you know, lots of the PAs, secretaries, kind of the people who bear the brunt of bad behaviour often. And I feel like sometimes these roles only focus or engage with the very, very senior. So how much having an independent advisor will help perhaps those who are going to struggle the most? I don't know. I feel like there's a much more sort of wholesale change that needs to happen, but it needs to be bottom up.
And you yourself have moved on. You've got a new career. You've got a new baby. If you've known how bad it would be, and looking back, would you have done it? Would you have still gone the route you've gone?
It's a good question. I mean, I do have a baby, and I'm not sure I would want my son to take the same path. But at the same time, I feel really proud to have achieved change, whether it's change for women on period poverty, or whether it's trying to just represent a different class of people, to senior people like prime ministers and chancellors. So I guess that's a half answer. I'm grateful for what I was able to do, but perhaps right now I wouldn't be encouraging a small child into politics unless there is major change about how people are supported.
OK, Sonia Khan, it's been lovely to talk to you. Thanks a lot. Former Special Advisors Sajid Javid and Philip Hammond. Thank you. Well, that is it for this week's Sophy Ridge on Sunday with me, Jayne Secker. In a moment after the break, we'll run through today's interviews and see what we've learned. I'll be joined by our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. Thanks for joining us this Sunday morning. Good morning and welcome to Sophy Ridge, The Take, this morning with me, Jayne Secker. This is where we look in more detail at what we talked about with our guests in the last hour. And to help us do just that, I'm joined by our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. And Sam, what did you make of the show? Did I do all right?
Hello there, Jayne. I was just watching the show and looking at the messages that are coming in and reading the Sunday papers, and my goodness, it's just rubbish being Rishi Sunak at the moment. You know, because of the standards set this year in British politics, I mean, 2022 has just been one hell of a year. We've ousted one Prime Minister, we've ousted a second Prime Minister, and I think, and that feels to everybody like we've A, exhausted ourselves, and B, raised the bar as to what you might call a crisis. But listening to those interviews, there's just no bit of Rishi Sunak's time in number 10 that feels like it's going particularly well. His political inheritance is dreadful. He is having to cope with these public sector strikes where, bluntly, you know, the reason, as we were talking about earlier, that James Cleverly isn't open to more negotiations, I think, is that the government just think there's no money left to give inflation or even near inflation increases to all sorts of bits of the public sector because of all of the spending, partly that, you know, Rishi Sunak was the author of during the pandemic and afterwards. And so he's stuck between the unions and the public finances. In some senses, he's stuck between the unions and his own party. One of the big things that's going on behind the scenes this morning is that once again the Conservative Party is in massive revolt, this time over tax. There's a big letter just gone out from 40 Tory MPs complaining that the tax rates that he set in the autumn statement just 3 or 4 weeks ago are too high. There's another big campaign effectively targeting him, led by Priti Patel and a massive Tory donor called Peter Cruddas, basically suggesting that his government is taxing too high and that in some way he's an illegitimate leader. So you've got political problems, you've got policy problems, there are very few friends. His political inheritance from Boris Johnson and Liz Truss is dreadful. He's lost every demographic age-wise except for over 65s. It is just miserable, and that's even before the next 2 weeks of strikes everywhere you look start to begin.
No, it's not a great couple of weeks ahead to look forward to before Christmas, is it, Sam? Well, let's start with my interview with the Foreign Secretary. The Royal College of Nursing has offered to call off these strikes this week if the government agrees to serious negotiations over pay. I pressed James Cleverly on why the government isn't just sitting down directly with the unions to open negotiations and prevent the walkouts.
That is the role of the independent pay review body. It's the clues in the name. It's independent and it reviews pay awards for those bodies. But they're not the ones who control the purse strings. They're not the ones who make the decision. It's a recommendation they make. It's up to the government. It is a recommendation. It's a recommendation and a recommendation. It's a recommendation and a recommendation that we have agreed to implement. But it just doesn't seem that there's any way to resolve this then. If the government is saying we are simply not going to move from what the independent pay review body says, we are not willing to negotiate at all with the nurses about what they believe. Sorry, this question is going around in circles. The point is, I feel like I'm not getting a straight answer. No, I am. Sorry, you're not getting an answer you like. No, but that's different. I'm giving you a straight answer. I'm struggling to understand why. The independent pay review bodies. How do we resolve it? The independent pay review bodies were created to resolve differences between the bodies that are seeking pay, whether they be in the health profession, teaching profession, other professions, and the government that hold the purse strings. They are the adjudicator. They were created. They are independent of government. They are staffed by experts. That is why they exist. They make recommendations, and in this instance, the government has accepted the recommendation fully. But the nurses don't accept it, and it seems, therefore, that there is no way to move forward from this. Well, as I said, the Health Secretary has said his door is open. He wants to talk to the health professionals about how we drive performance in the NHS, how we make sure that it's a job that they want to do, that all these things. But as I say, the independent pay review bodies do what we ask them to do, which is to review pay independent of the government. Or we accept their recommendation. Well, let's get more from Sam Coates. And you know, the independent pay review bodies aren't an arbitration service, are they, Sam? They set these levels, they recommend these levels to the government, but the government just doesn't seem to think it should get in between them and, for example, the nurses.
That's right, Jayne. And that was a frustrating listen, right? Hearing those exchanges, because you were absolutely right. All the independent pay review bodies do, and it's a very important role, is to come up with a figure, a recommendation, and then the government decides what to do next. And the recommendation was made for nurses back in June. It was the 14th of June. That's when they published their pay review report. And then it's entirely up to ministers what to do next, looking at the public finances. And by the way, ministers do have an input into the pay review bodies, but then they get to say what happens next. And it's completely normal that ministers vary what the pay review bodies do. Ministers, since time immemorial, have been doing it. And critically, and this is the difficult thing for this government, that's exactly what they've done up in Scotland, where, by the way, there are no nurses on strike this Thursday, because the Scottish government went a bit further. But in England, in Wales and in Northern Ireland, those administrations decided that they weren't going to offer that little bit more, and as a result, the RCN, the Royal College of Nurses, and Unison are pressing ahead with that strike action. So Jayne's cleverly there, sort of sidestepping and trying to not really get into a discussion about whether or not, if the unions are serious about a below-inflation pay settlement, then what that might mean. Now, I have to say that off the record to The Observer, the unions seem to be hinting that they would accept a settlement that's a little bit lower than inflation. What I can't find is an on-the-record commitment to that, and in some places this morning, union representatives are still talking for above inflation pay settlement, and you heard the BMA representative on your programme also talk about the need to get back some of the pay that they lost because of inflation over the last few years. So it's not quite clear to me exactly what the unions mean by potentially accepting a below inflation pay settlement, so we ought to be careful about taking that on trust until we see exactly what that means. But we can't even get there because ministers don't even look like they want to engage on that. Labour, as ever, trying to force apart some division. Wes Streeting out and about earlier this week, seeming to say that maybe there was a little bit further that he could go beyond the pay review, but he's a little bit less keen to echo that language today. But I think that as people enter this miserable fortnight and look forward to a grim start to 2023, I think that just the spectre of ministers not talking to the unions will come back and back and back.
Indeed. Well, the Royal College of Nursing's offer to hold off on strikes if the government comes to the table, as you were saying, to negotiate over pay was something that I raised when I spoke to Labour's Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting. He said it was too good an offer to turn down.
The Royal College of Nursing and Unison have said just last night that if the government is prepared to sit down and talk about pay and all of the other issues, they will suspend strike action this week. Now, I think that is an offer that is too good to refuse, and I want the government to explain why they're not prepared to sit down and even talk, even though they know that patients will experience real disruption as a result of strike action.
And Sam, our viewers, especially those up in Scotland, will know that they are closer to a pay deal up there. 7.5% is what's being offered up there. And there is some speculation in some of the papers that may be the sort of ballpark that maybe some of the unions are willing to start these negotiations with the government at.
Yeah, and we always talk about pay negotiations just about the figure, don't we? Possibly 7.5, possibly something else. But the sort of secret of pay review negotiations is it's often as much about the terms and conditions and changes to working practices and a far more complicated set of changes to contracts below the surface, as much as it is about that headline figure. And of course, in Wales, there's a Labour administration there. There are strikes heading, there are nurses' strikes heading there too, and announced much after the English ones. There are also going to be strikes in Northern Ireland. So it's not like the government in London is the only one to be facing this difficulty and feeling its way through this problem. But yeah, there is essentially a challenge that nurses feel is unignorable. With inflation over 10%, they just want to raise that offer. the problem that you've got politically is that for however Wes Streeting might say ministers should get to the table, they need to go further. Labour isn't setting the bar. They're not saying we would offer 7.5, inflation or anything else. They too politically are trying to tough this out, and whilst putting the pressure, as much pressure as possible on the government, and trying to avoid actually saying what they would do, which is why actually interviewing Labour frontbenchers could be a somewhat frustrating task when it comes to this, because as we've often talked about before on this lot, there's a great secret behind the scenes in British politics, which is that ministers do expect inflation to come tumbling down very quickly next year, with it returning not that far off from 2.5–3% by the end of next year. So they are hoping that this issue of public sector discontent goes away fairly soon in the new year. But that's all predicated on essentially the problems with Russia and energy prices, the key cornerstone that's driven up inflation, and problems with trade with China going away. But on neither Ukraine and Russia nor on Chinese trade does it look like actually the drivers of rising inflation are particularly easing at the moment. So who knows what's going to happen next year? It may be a bit of wishful thinking, both on the government side and on Labour's side, that this isn't going to be an issue before too long, and in which case people might be pressed further, and if Labour don't have more of a concrete offer, perhaps that could come back to trouble them. But at the moment this really is the government's problem, and I think people will be looking at them day to day because they're in charge and the strikes are starting this week.
OK, Sam, stay with us. We're going to take a short break, but we're going to be talking with Sam a little bit more about the conversations we had this morning with James Cleverly and Wes Streeting. Stay with us.
59% of people who do follow fitness throughout the year stop during the winter. It's darker, it's colder. That sofa seems to get you sucked in with a cup of tea and a biscuit watching the TV. But it's really important, and not just for physical health, but for mental health. That's why we do all suffer from getting sad in the winter. I do have a few tips, kind of strange ones. You know FOMO, the expression, fear of missing out? I'm going to change that into a positive. So the first one, be flexible. Try and change your working day around. Get up early, get outside, feel the natural sunlight and the nature of outdoors and use that. The other one is have an outdoor lunch. Be prepared in the morning, make a hot flask of soup or anything, take it out and just get outside at lunchtime. That will inspire you. Meetings on the move. We are a cafe culture society, which I love coffee, but get a takeaway reusable cup and walk and talk. Change the way you think about how you do physical exercise in the winter. And the other one is online. During the pandemic, so many professionals put their programs online. So carve out 20, 30 minutes in the evening to just get those endorphins going. Because like I said, it's not just what you need physically, it's mentally staying strong and happy during the colder months. We have so much variety to what we can do. Get outside and be active, get that heart rate up. I always find setting a goal helps. So I'm a ski racer. I think about, right, my first trip to Austria, backtrack on that. How can I prepare physically for that? So goals really help. And community. Find yourself a community. I actually use Instagram for this. My Instagram followers are accountable for me getting outside and being active. So find people who you can train with who say, hey, listen, I'm not up for it today, but are you still going? Because I'll join you. Very, very important. Everyone overindulges at Christmas. That's why we wear these big woolly Christmas jumpers. That's totally fine. You've got enough time. It's not really about how you feel aesthetically or look aesthetically. It's about the health benefits. And obviously, I'm so fortunate to be able to ski in Austria for the whole winter and be out there and have that goal and that motivation. Not many people have that, but it's about knowing that you're doing this for your long-term benefit.
I'm Inzamam Rashid and I'm Sky's North of England correspondent. We give a voice to communities often unheard and unserved from a region with a distinct history and global impact.
Welcome back to Sophy Ridge on Sunday. The Take this morning with me, Jayne Secker. And this is where we take a look back through the morning's interviews with analysis from our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates. Well, earlier we spoke to the British Medical Association on the programme and its Deputy Chair, Dr Emma Runswick. She's hit out at Wes Streeting, saying that comments from the Shadow Health Secretary on improving standards in the health service were disappointing. It's something I raised with Mr Streeting.
It's unacceptable that people have to wait on the phone at 8 o'clock in the morning to get through to GP. I have been treated like some kind of heretic by the BMA, and I'm afraid, I do understand the pressure that doctors are under. They do a very difficult job against very difficult backdrop. But what I'm saying is, if we're putting investment into the NHS, as the next Labour government will, we have got to expect better results for patients. And ultimately, it's my job to be the patient's champion. I'm a patient myself. I've had great experience on the NHS. I've also had not great experience on the NHS. I want to make sure that everyone in this country gets a great experience and that we've got an NHS that's fit for the future.
And let's bring in Sam Coates. Sam, I thought it was really interesting because his article today, he talks about the NHS not being a shrine, which really struck me as something, coming from a Labour politician. This is a man who's fighting cancer, fought cancer, has had real close dealings with the NHS recently, and saying that he's not scared to take on the unions.
That's right, and he did so in the Sunday Telegraph. So that is effectively a message that he wants to get across to current Conservative voters to make it clear, really, there's a piece of very crude politics, and we can see it from space, can't we, Jane? Labour often accused of being too close to the unions, and what's interesting is that the government hopes that this is a wedge between Labour Party and the voters to highlight those links. And so what's going on is that Wes Streeting, and to a certain extent Keir Starmer, but Wes Streeting really in the lead with this, is trying to put just that little bit of distance between the front bench, the Labour front bench, and key unions. Now, why might they be able to do it, be wanting to do that at this point? Well, clearly the strikes are first and foremost in people's minds. And if you just look at the most recent polling, since the summer, a YouGov poll has found that there's been an 8 percentage point increase in people that think that trade unions have a negative role in public life. Effectively, unions were favourably viewed. Now they're pretty much half and half, level pegging for those who think that they do a good job and those that think that they do a bad job. And that change is inescapably linked to the wave of strikes that's going on. There is also more people who believe that the unions are able to strike too easily, and you've got the government looking to sort of capitalise on that by potentially in the new year bringing forward legislation to toughen strike laws, although we don't know quite how they might do that at this point. So Labour trying to just sort of come off the hook of looking like they're in the union's pockets by refusing to agree with their demands about increasing public sector pay, as we were saying before the break, in line with inflation, and just tonally look like they're distancing themselves so that they aren't just speaking up for what they would see as vested interests for the staff rather than the patients. And that's the kind of job of work that Wes Streeting was trying to communicate very clearly. It helped, as you say, that he has personal huge experience of the NHS as somebody who had to be treated successfully for cancer 3 or 4 years ago, and that he can speak with personal authority on this. But there's a political job being done here, which is just to detach a little bit more for Labour from the unions, because that's the link that the Conservatives will seek to highlight as much as they can in the coming weeks.
But of course, also during the course of that interview, I pressed him on the Labour Party's dealings with the unions in terms of funding, and he said, that he was really proud that the unions had supported Labour for so long. It was why the Labour Party came into existence. No signs that Labour Party was going to step back from a large amount of its funding coming from the unions.
Absolutely, and we saw that with some Electoral Commission figures that were out last week. There was just a huge proportion of Labour funding still comes from the unions, and despite some sabre rattling over the last few months that the unions might reduce the proportion of funding for the Labour Party, we haven't yet seen that. And so the Labour Party is in need of that union funding, and keeping them sweet, despite that little bit of distancing, remains a priority. So it's a difficult tightrope for Labour frontbenchers, as the interviews showed.
It really is, isn't it? Sam, really good to talk to you. Thanks very much for joining us on The Take. We're going to be talking more in a minute. We're doing a podcast when we come off air, which you can access later on. So please feel free to join us for that. So that is it from Sophy Ridge on Sunday and The Take this morning. I hope you've enjoyed our morning interviews. We are not back next Sunday. Well, I certainly am not anyway. Back in the new year. So do join Sophy for that and have a very pleasant Christmas for those of you who won't be joining until then. Thanks a lot.